Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Wagner. I work for the International Center for Migration Policy Development as a Senior Policy Advisor Asylum. At ICMPD, we are part of a consortium working on the traffic project, which also hosts this webinar. This webinar is part of a webinar series, of a Zooming in on Migration and Asylum webinar series, which is an initiative of several Horizon 2020 research projects. And together with our sister projects, Atmigov, Magic, Mignex, we host webinars in a rotated manner. And this webinar today is hosted by the Traffic Project. I thank you for participating and being with us today, and I look very much forward to this today's session. Let me just tell you a few words about the Traffic Project. As mentioned, it's a Horizon 2020 research project. We work we research on people in protracted displacement situation. Our consortium conducts empirical research in several sites, like in Africa, where we have research in Tanzania, Ethiopia, and DRC. Then we also in Middle East, Jordan, and also Pakistan. And also we have one chapter on Europe, which has some empirical research in Greece, Italy, and Germany. With the research, we try to better understand the reasons for and possible solutions out of protracted displacement situations. In traffic, we understand protected displacement as a figuration in which displaced people's capabilities and opportunities are severely limited for prolonged periods of time. One of our essential hypotheses that we have is the better people are connected and the more mobile they are, the less likely they fall into protracted displacement situations. Our webinar today looks into one specific form of a potential, let's say, third country solution for refugees, and this is complementary pathways. Just a few words on this. Complementary pathways gained much attention recently, while in the past it was mostly labeled as safe and legal pathways for refugees. The Global Compact on refugees prominently featured complementary pathways as a pathway for refugees, which should complement resettlement, which should be reserved for most vulnerable refugees. Also within the European Union, one finds several references, particularly in the new Pact on Asylum and Migration. And just today, a bit earlier, the European Asylum Support Office published its report on asylum in 2020. And among others, it also refers to, and I quote, resettlement programs and complementary pathways as are crucial in providing predictable, safe, and legal access to safety with growing migration flows. We will hear during the webinar different views also on complementary pathways. So far, this instrument has been mostly described by naming different examples of such complementary pathways, like referring to human corridor, humanitarian visa, and others such pathways. We will hear more about that. I think what is commonly, though, is that complementary pathways very much concentrated on the element of the pathway. My colleague will soon describe a bit more in detail, a bit a different approach where we center our thinking around networks and the resources of individuals themselves. And we took quite some inspiration from the Traffic Project research, where we looked also on how networks help people out of displacement and how displaced people make use of these resources. But we also took note and inspiration from the Western Balkans regulation. We will come back to that a bit later. Also to community sponsorship, and also this will be one of the issues that we will tackle rather soon in this webinar. So with this panel today, we try to have these elements included by the speakers that we invited, and I already now thank very much the speakers for being with us. We are still not yet full, the panel, but I think the connection should hopefully soon work with the remaining colleagues. We will start this webinar with an introduction of our recent traffic policy brief on complementary pathways by my colleague Caitlin Katsiafikas, and move then to community sponsorship. We will hear from Niklas Tan. And then we will move to examples by the German Western Balkans regulation by Mariella Feitenhein, and then come to some theoretical but also practical comments on migrant networks by Sonia Pereira. And finally, we will have some reflections by UNHCR from Anna Gecht. During these various inputs, I would like to encourage and invite you to use the chat function and to pose questions to the panelists. You can do this during the presentations, and I'm very much hopeful that we can then, after this first inputs from the panelists, include as many as possible of your questions. I think with that, I would like to get started. Our first speaker is Caitlin Katsiafikas. She is policy analyst in ICMPD's policy unit. Has experience working on asylum and migration at think tanks, national and local government agencies, and NGOs. Before joining ICMPD, she worked at the Migration Policy Institute, the World Bank and International Rescue Committee, and the George Washington University. Caitlin, please, can you possibly start with introducing also our thinking around complementary pathways and also reflecting on the recent policy brief that we just published? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I will just share my screen right now. Are you able to see it just fine? Great. So I will be speaking today about a policy brief that was just recently published for the Traffic Project, co-authored by Martin and myself, which looks at the importance of networks and mobility for expanding complementary pathways to protection in Europe and beyond. So Martin already mentioned how complementary pathways developed and how they are generally understood today. In this policy brief, we argue that complementary pathways can be particularly useful for those refugees who have some human or social capital, including networks, but whose resources aren't sufficient for them to access a third country solution on their own. They could be well understood, we think, as an intermediate third country solution between resettlement and legal pathways, which might overlap in both directions, as shown in this visual here. Resettlement as a protection tool offers a third country solution to the most vulnerable refugees, those who have no social or professional connections or financial means. Well-connected refugees, meanwhile, might rely fully on their own resources. And here I mean financial means, skills, and personal and professional connections to find protection and better long-term opportunities on their own. This group is likely to use legal migration pathways. So complementary pathways in turn might offer third country solutions for those in between. Relatedly, we put forth that facilitating movement based on refugees' human and social capital could become the key added value of complementary pathways. And in this way, we wish to also address the common misperception that refugees don't possess capital, whether this is human, social, or financial, and look towards how policies and programs can enable refugees to make use of their resources. So stepping back for a moment, I'll first look at legal pathways. So several examples show that refugees are already using existing migratory pathways outside of the international refugee regime. These Eurostat data, for instance, show first-time residence permits issued for nationals of major source countries of refugees with a high protection need, and this is determined by a recognition rate of above 50%. As you can see here, citizens from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia, and Yemen have made considerable use of legal pathways to come to Europe for family, education, and work reasons in that order. As you'll see, the number of people arriving via residence permits far outnumbers those who are arriving via refugee resettlement, although it is lower than the number of positive decisions for international protection that were granted to asylum seekers after arriving in Europe. These findings are in line with a UNHCR OECD study that was updated this year and maps the residence permits issued by OECD countries and Brazil to citizens of 7 major source countries of refugees with also high recognition rates. According to their calculations, nearly 1.5 million first-time residence permits were granted in the same period, 2010 to 2019, on the grounds of family, work, or study. So it's important to mention that there are several shortcomings with the existing data. For one, the countries listed here are major source countries of refugees, and it can therefore be assumed that a large number of these nationals would have a well-founded claim for refugee status, but the exact number isn't known. Additionally, countries report data a bit differently, which can make comparability a challenge, and other issues might lead to overcounting as well as undercounting. But overall, despite these data challenges, the numbers clearly show that refugees do use existing pathways and seek individual solutions outside of the refugee regime if their resources and networks allow them to do so. So bringing networks into the equation now, research conducted by the traffic team shows that refugees are working to capitalize on their networks and to find solutions to displacement. And these solutions include mobility via existing migratory pathways. These networks that refugees have, they might consist of local and translocal connections, also maybe transnational connections, including friends, new and old, family, professional contacts, staff of NGOs, and members of faith communities. Regarding the quality and the quantity of connections, it's the quality of their networks that is particularly important for opening up opportunities such as jobs or housing. And our research shows that in many cases, new connections are made through institutionalized networks. So this means that policymakers and practitioners on the ground can help to build and strengthen refugees' networks. A variety of actors can step in to provide access to their network, for example, and they could also provide spaces for refugees to build their own networks. There are already several migration pathways that make use of networks or ways that people can leverage their networks for mobility using channels that already exist, as you can see here. Family reunification is perhaps the most obvious example, as a close family connection is required for people migrating via this channel. We see community sponsorship as an important network, and this is one that has been gaining momentum in Europe. We'll of course hear a bit later on about how community sponsorship can be applied to complementary pathways. Networks have also been leveraged via scholarship programs for students who have been displaced. In Europe, the Portuguese-led Global Platform for Syrian Students is one example, and it has built since 2013 networks for students so they can receive education or finalize their studies that were interrupted by the conflict in Syria. Looking at labor mobility, several actors have engaged in facilitating this mobility from different angles. Talent Beyond Boundaries is perhaps the organization that's received the most attention. It connects the talents and skills of refugees in major host countries like Jordan or Lebanon with employers in Western countries using a specifically designed talent catalog. Other initiatives look at intra-EU mobility based on refugee schemes, such as activities by CEDEFOP and Move Europe. Numerous civil society networks have emerged at the national level to connect refugees with employers, while businesses are also creating networks such as the Tent Partnership for Refugees. As Martin mentioned, we also found inspiration from Germany's Western Balkans regulation and also a bilateral agreement to relocate refugees from Greece to Portugal based on their skills, which we'll hear about later in this webinar. Looking across all these pathways, the trends towards digitalization also offers many opportunities to bridge long distances and to create or maintain translocal and transnational networks. This can open up new opportunities, new markets, and new networks to people who might otherwise be left out due to their displacement. Digital platforms can also increase the visibility of refugees' human and social capital to employers or universities abroad, which can be key to accessing these mobility opportunities. So in this understanding, complementary pathways aren't necessarily new pathways, but are rather policies that enable refugees to use their resources, including their social and professional networks and skills, And this requires that policymakers invest in building and leveraging quality networks and also in adjusting entry conditions. So I'll conclude with 6 ways to move forward on complementary pathways, and you can see more, of course, in the policy brief. First, in acknowledging the human and social capital that refugees possess, complementary pathways could become a tool that offers refugees the possibility to seize opportunities based on their skills and networks. Second, because refugees have social and professional networks, but these are often too weak to capitalize on, complementary pathways should devise networking strategies to make refugees' connections stronger. Networks in receiving countries might develop further around the community sponsorship schemes, as this approach encourages and allows for flexible refugee support networks that can be based, for instance, on communities, individuals, employers, universities, faith groups, or civil society. Corresponding structures in key countries of first asylum can also play an important role by connecting refugees to information about employment and education opportunities, about navigating the required bureaucracy, and also to make the skills of refugees visible to employers abroad. Development actors could play a particularly important role here. Third, refugees whose human or social capital offer them the prospect of livelihoods in a third country, such as being received by a community or having reasonable prospects of employment, should be met with more flexibility regarding their entry conditions. So this could include the waiving of entry conditions for existing pathways that might be difficult for refugees to fulfill, for instance, because of a lack of required documentation. Fourth, current governance structures separate the admission of refugees from the admission of other legal migrants, and complementary pathways therefore often lack an organizational home. Investing in networking opportunities for refugees requires initiatives in Europe and in first countries of asylum, demanding that the policies that encompass the internal and external dimension of EU policy and thus involve different actors. So progress on complementary pathways really requires these actors to overcome sectoral governance approaches and to seek synergies between these areas. Fifth, the connection of networks and facilitated admission opportunities for refugees we propose could build on lessons learned from initiatives like the German Western Balkans regulation. Additionally, further research on the legal pathways that people are using without entering the refugee regime may inform policies that can strengthen refugee networks to leverage complementary pathways. Sixth, and finally, enabling refugees to capitalize upon their resources, connections, and skills to access third country solutions could in turn create more space for those refugees who are lacking social, human, and/or financial capital and who need more support from the international community, which would ultimately enable these pathways to become truly complementary instruments for refugees to access protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for this overview also on the policy brief and also some references to inspirations that we took from other initiatives. I think there was also mentioned now in the chat one very valid comment about the notion and why we say safe and legal routes instead, why we don't stay with safe and legal routes instead of but now creating a new wording, complementary pathways, which is quite unknown to all. I think I will get back to this one more time when we have also UNHCR in here, whether they are to also ask what is the background there. I think it is indeed something that, the wording came up, and we see this with so many such creating new wordings, but having the same content that was before. And I think the safe and legal routes is, of course, that's what should be the substance of complementary pathways. I will hope that we will get a bit later on these questions one more time back. And I would like to invite you to use the chat function and pose us further questions, to which we will come then afterwards one more time back. I would like to, Caitlin, also you mentioned about quality of networks, and this is also something that we had in the traffic project, that it's not only the quantity of networks, but very much also the quality of networks. And I would very much like to use this to move over to you, Nicholas. Nicholas Feitenhein is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, where he works on international refugee law and policy. He's member of the Asylum project, another Horizon 2020 project, which researches the role of the EU in global asylum governance in light of the Global Compact on Refugees. He acted as consultant for Amnesty International, the Danish Refugee Council, and UNHCR. Very much pleased to have you with us here, Nicholas. Nicholas, you looked in your research closely also on community sponsorship, and this was also mentioned by Caitlin, also one of the things that we took inspiration, and also something where I believe that the quality of networks is very much core to the idea of community sponsorship. Can you probably elaborate a bit about the role of community sponsorship for complementary pathways? We often read community sponsorship as a separate kind of complementary pathways, but it is also very much a network that could strengthen, as Caitlin said, people's third country solution. Please, Nicholas, your considerations about this.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you very much for the invitation to this seminar. I read your brief with great interest. And look, in my 10-minute, rather lo-fi intervention, I would like to touch on three elements of this relationship between community sponsorship on the one hand, complementary pathways, and of course networks, the sort of topic of discussion today. I should say at the outset that my research in this area has focused on the role of community sponsorship in the broader international refugee regime, of course, in particular under the auspices of the Global Compact on Refugees. And in particular, I've worked on how and why European governments take up community sponsorship or choose not to, in fact, since its sort of policy export from Canada since the New York Declaration. So what I'll do in my brief intervention today is firstly try to set up some definitions around what we mean when we talk about community sponsorship, which is, I think, rather a fuzzy and at least a sort of umbrella concept for a range of policy modalities. Secondly, I'll very briefly map the uptake of community sponsorship models in Europe in the past 5 to 6 years. And thirdly, in keeping with the theme of the day, I'll make some reflections on how networks in different community sponsorship settings play a key role, inspired, of course, by Martin and Caitlin's policy brief. So firstly, to this definitional question, I mean, how do we define community sponsorship? As I've mentioned, it's best understood as an umbrella term. UNHCR considers programs where individuals or groups come together to provide financial, emotional, and practical support towards reception and integration of refugees as a sort of working definition of community sponsorship. That's fine, that's a completely workable definition. However, there are, I think, three rather separate sort of strains or models of community sponsorship currently conceived today in policy circles. And the first one is perhaps the classical one, and that is community sponsorship as privately led admission and integration of refugees via an autonomous complementary pathway, or as Jeff would prefer, a safe and legal route. So this is sort of the original Canadian approach of private refugee sponsorship. Such models are firmly separated from state resettlement and involve private individuals or associations providing for an alternative pathway and then support for integration of named refugees. And the point here, I guess, is that this privately led admission is often highly networked in the sense that refugee beneficiaries are named and individually selected by sponsors rather than coming from a broader resettlement pool. The second strain of community sponsorship currently in place is rather separate, and this is what I'm calling sponsored resettlement, which is not focused on how a person enters the country or the establishment of new safe and legal routes or a new pathway, but rather focused on integration assistance for resettled refugees. And this model of community sponsorship uses existing UNHCR and state resettlement pathways, including selection, health referrals, et cetera, to admit refugees. And then private or civil society involvement really kicks in after arrival to provide integration support to allow for successful integration. And here, of course, rather than naming specific refugees for protection, you're drawing on UNHCR's rather significant pool of UNHCR resettlement referrals. So they're two, of course, related, but in some ways rather separate concepts of community sponsorship currently in operation. And finally, the most recent and perhaps the broadest concept of community sponsorship I've seen is as a so-called wraparound tool for either resettlement or any given complementary pathway. So this would extend to refugee students, refugee workers, family reunification, and any other pathways. So this sort of working definition does not focus on either the pathway or the resettlement status, but rather on simple civic engagement embracing refugees. And of course, it opens up the idea of sort of hybrid approaches where you have, for example, a university scholarship pathway, which is supported by a wraparound community sponsorship element. And we've seen this, I think, in some Italian education pathways. Now, in conceptualizing these three sort of working definitions, my own conclusion would be that there's significant strength in community sponsorship's flexibility, that it can be so versatile in different situations depending on the national or indeed subnational setting. On the other hand, this sort of fluffiness leaves a really serious conversation about definitions a little bit vague sometimes. So that final definition I have some problems with, I must admit. Now, in terms of trying to solidify sort of some core elements of community sponsorship, I'm going to put forward 5 sort of characteristics to you. This is based on my own work. It's somehow slightly normative, but I think these are sort of should be the core stable elements of any community sponsorship model. So firstly and fundamentally, of course, community sponsorship involves the sharing of responsibility for financial and integration support between government on the one hand and civil society or individuals on the other for a defined period. Secondly, of course, inherent to community sponsorship is the model involves the controlled arrival of refugees, either as asylum seekers holding humanitarian visas or as recognised refugees beforehand. And of course, it's important to acknowledge the rather serious implications of this controlled arrival vis-a-vis spontaneous arrival and what that might mean for access to asylum. Thirdly, of course, in principle, community sponsorship should be additional to state resettlement programs. This question has been historically fundamental to the Canadian model, but is less pronounced in Europe. And what I would suggest is that if not additional from the outset, community sponsorship models should be at least additional in principle, that is with the aim of going over and above state resettlement quotas. Fourthly, of course, in the case of sponsorship breakdown or relationship breakdown, government authorities retain ultimate responsibility for the protection of refugees. And finally, community sponsorship financially involves the funding of refugee integration or support coming from either private individuals or civil society, or indeed subnational government bodies. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'll skip over the questions of sort of current uptake in Europe, except to say that after sort of 40 years of essentially isolated operation in Canada, we've seen the uptake in Europe from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and the UK since 2015 alone. And at the first Global Refugee Forum, we saw further Belgium, Malta, and Portugal pledge to pilot community sponsorship. So I'm in complete agreement that there's significant momentum around these policy settings, and we're likely to see significant uptake in future. So let me finally turn then to this question of networks and the role networks play in community sponsorship models. Now, what I've set out for you is that community sponsorship, of course, encompasses a range of modalities. So let me try and highlight which networks play a key role when. The first, of course, is in relation to these sort of naming-based programs, where, again, in its original form in Canada, community sponsorship involved the clear identification and naming of individual refugees by sponsors. And more recently, the Humanitarian Corridors model in Italy is a good example of community sponsorship based on this naming model. And so here we see the emergence not only of networks within sponsor groups, but indeed networks of former refugees along often national or ethnic lines. So in Canada, we've seen generations of refugees who were previously sponsored, then becoming sponsors themselves, of course, forming essentially transnational networks to allow the admission of extended family or indeed other nationals. With respect to community sponsorship as a form of resettlement, of course, the sort of beneficiary networks are far less pronounced. And instead, what we observe here is a significant focus on civil society networks. So in Europe, groups like Caritas, the Italian faith-based groups, Rotary, are playing a key role transnationally to form the basis for civil society networks to support refugees after arrival via UNHCR admission. And finally, of course, if we consider community sponsorship as a sort of wraparound tool, then you have these overlapping networks where you have university networks on the one hand, joined by perhaps faith-based groups or civil society groups on the other to provide support. And finally, my final point that I would leave you with is, while community sponsorship is often thought as a sort of bottom-up model, a grassroots civil society-led approach, my research shows that, in fact, the establishment of new models is very often top-down. And this, I would suggest, is very much due to the role of government exchanges, study tours, lessons learning between policymakers, so that is to say government-based networks, policy-based networks, to lesson learn from one another and, in fact, play a key role in deciding whether indeed to establish a new community sponsorship program or otherwise. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas, for also bringing the connection between community sponsorship and complementary pathways. I found quite all this interesting when you said this role in naming refugees that you mentioned. I think this is one of the crucial things where this network comes very, very strongly in there, or the potential of networks, be it from family relations, employment relations, and so on. I also appreciate your consideration about this bottom-up and top-down approach. I think this is something quite crucial for community sponsorship as a network of communities that very often comes from bottom-up, but more and more states also try to do their stake and try to bring this top-down approach also in there. I think we will have a few points afterwards, I hope, on this. I would like now to move to another area that is actually it was not actually formed for refugees or for people in search of protection, or it had some relations to it, but still not per se. This refers to the Western Balkan regulation from Germany, and I want to invite Mariella Feitenhein. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Employment Research. She has worked there since December 2017. Before that, she received her doctoral degree from Hertie School of Governance. And her research interests include poverty, integration, governance in the context of labor migration and forced migration, as well as qualitative methods. Mariella, we already heard a few times the Western Balkan regulation. I guess not all people who listen to us today are aware of this Western Balkan regulation. Can you probably first a bit introduce this regulation and this instrument, and then also probably provide some considerations from your side how this could possibly linked to complementary pathways, if you have a few words on that, but also the potential of networks that is in this Western Balkan regulation inherent. Mariella, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. to this very interesting seminar. And I want to share with you some experiences from the Western Balkans regulation in Germany. If you want, this is a real case study that is in several regards relevant to for some of the aspects that we are discussing today. I will share my screen with you. I hope you can see the presentation. Yes, perfect. So let me start with this. The Western Balkans regulation has a specific political history. In 2014 and 15, Germany saw a very strong increase in the number of people from the Western Balkans states who came to Germany to apply for asylum. However, their chances to get asylum were very low, and the administration was overburdened. And this led to two political decisions. The first was Germany classified the countries of the Western Balkan states as safe countries of origin, which means that asylum applications from people of the Western Balkan states had even lower chances to get accepted. And the second political decision was to introduce the Western Balkans regulation. And the objective of that regulation is the following. It was to reduce the incentives for immigration of asylum seekers, and if you want to create an alternative route or a complementary route, one could say, this was to facilitate labor migration with this new regulation. And this is directly codified in the regulation, which is interesting. The regulation stipulates a certain time period, I think 24 months, for those people who had applied for asylum in Germany, who now have time to go back to their countries and to apply for a visa based on the Western Balkans regulation, and then to come eventually as labor migrants. So what is the essence of the Western Balkans regulation? The regulation allows citizens of 6 Western Balkan states to take up employment in Germany. These are the 6 states: Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia, which are not part of the European Union. And a major requirement is a binding job offer. So they need to show their working contract, but they do not need to make proof of qualifications, professional qualifications. And this is a real exception in Germany's migration regime. So in sum, with its political history and goals and also essence, the Western Balkans regulation, if you want, is a policy experiment or has really entered new territory. So the Western Balkans regulation is now in place for 5 years, and the first 5 years show that it has not remained a marginal scheme. Far from that, it has developed into a central migration scheme in Germany in the field of labor migration from third countries. So I want to give you very few numbers. Within the first 5 years of the existence of that regulation, the German administration has processed almost 321,000 requests for preliminary approval that the Federal Employment Agency has to grant, and approximately 131,000 visas. Out of these, the Federal Employment Agency granted around 260,000 approvals, and the German embassies granted around or almost 100,000 visas. And these numbers show two things. First of all, you see that there was apparently high demand on the part of German enterprises and employers, and also on the part of people willing to take that route and to go to Germany based on the Western Balkans regulation. Second, the data show that less than every third request led to a granted visa. And this is something that can be a little bit explained. we maybe can touch on that later in the discussion. We also observe that in the same period, the number of applications for asylum substantially decreased. And last word on the first 5 years. The first 5 years were followed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can imagine, the trend in terms of numbers was halted by the pandemic due to several factors related to the labor market and also travel restrictions and so forth. So we at the Institute for Employment Research evaluated the Western Balkans regulation in a mixed methods project. And the research team consisted of Herbert Brücker, Tanja Fendel, Markus Bromberger, Miriam Rabelay, just to mention all of us. And I want to emphasize very briefly 3 key findings of our evaluation. So in the observation period of that goes from 2016 to 17, so January 16 to December 17, we found that more than half of the workers from the Western Balkan states were employed as skilled workers or experts. And this is surprising because the regulation is, as I said, does not set qualification requirements and is open to also the low skilled. And interestingly, we find one explanation in our interviews with employers who valued practical working experience more than formal certificates. And this led to the fact that some people were employed as skilled workers, although de facto they didn't possess formal qualifications, formal vocational qualifications. Second, the earnings of the people coming based on the Western Balkans regulation are comparable to those of other migrant groups. We did several comparisons on which I could give further detail later. And third, we hardly see any unemployment and receipt of benefit during the observation period. So people who immigrated on the basis of that regulation were almost permanently employed. And this has several reasons. But it indicates that the regulation is not a big risk for the welfare state, as some have argued before. In our study, we also see or observe a number of problematic fields. First of all, we observed breaches of law on the part of employers. For instance, the withholding of wages or false pay slips or discriminatory actions. And this tells us something about the vulnerability of labor migrants, maybe especially the low-skilled. And second, we observed obvious administrative bottlenecks, especially in the visa process, that led to very long waiting times and prevented many employment relationships to realize, if you want. Unfortunately, based on our data, we are not able to say how many people used the Western Balkans regulation after having applied for asylum in Germany. This would be the golden key here in this webinar. We do not have the data to say something about this. Neither can we make statements about the performance of this subgroup, right? So if we look at the results that I've just presented. But what we can definitely say is that networks play a central role in the Western Balkans regulation. And this is, I think, the second big topic of today's panel. So our interviews with employers and employees show that networks have, in many cases, enabled immigration. So they have facilitated the coming about of employment relationships, and these networks were partly due to the historical and also contemporary ties between the Western Balkan states and Germany. We have, for instance, workers who have passed some years in Germany during their childhood as refugees during the wars in the 1990s, the wars in former Yugoslavia. We have also talked to many employers who themselves are originally from the Western Balkan states. And this is touching upon something that Nicholas has just addressed. So what is happening is we observe the activation of private networks, people knowing each other, employers knowing potential candidates and going in their home, traveling to their home country and asking them whether they want to work for them. We also see professional networks at work. For instance, when German employers had worked with students, for instance, from the Western Balkan states, and they now hire them again via the Western Balkans regulation. And then in some sectors, especially health and social services, we see that employers use foreign placement agencies, also part of a professional network, if you want, that become mediators to find suitable candidates from the Western Balkan states. Second, we observed that networks stabilize employment. They increase predictability for both sides. If employer and employee know each other, they know maybe also what to expect from the other side. And employers also think that they can better match applicants to job profiles if they know their competencies beforehand. As regards social integration, our data indicates that the functions of networks are maybe more ambiguous. On the one hand, networks can empower. For instance, network partners, this can be friends or acquaintances, whoever, can provide new information or resources that are important for example, finding a better job in Germany or gaining ground. But we also see that employers do much to keep their valued employees and provide them with opportunities to stay in Germany and to settle, especially to settle in Germany. We also have employers who finance and organize German language courses, for instance. What we also observe, and this is the last aspect I want to make here, we identified a disciplining function of networks. So what we see is instances of loyalty and gratitude that some of the employees that we interviewed, so we observed these instances in some of the employees that we interviewed. Some told us that they did not dare asking for legal support or changing jobs in case, for instance, the employer was a friend of the family, despite a contract breach or despite a negative development in the employment relationship. So in these cases, what we observe is feelings of normative commitment. The labor migrants think they ought to stay. And this can lead to problematic situations in which labor migrants exercise little agency. No, sorry, so they exercise little autonomy. As subjects on the labor market. All right, so in sum, we see that networks have fulfilled different functions, and this is certainly not a conclusive list. I will stop here. I hope we can discuss some of my points later on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Mariella. I think very nice overview about the Western Balkans regulation itself and the potential that I think also for lessons learned we have in this tool. Certainly, of course, the Western Balkan regulations, and you mentioned it, is a very specific instrument, a very specific group, which has many migrants from the Western Balkans are in Germany. So this is, of course, has per se already many links, family links, but also professional links. This is clear. But I think I like this. I found this very interesting also for further thinking complementary pathways, that we say if there is a strong link that will help you in the country, in the receiving country, with integration, with finding a job and so on, that then on the other side there could be some adjustments to the qualification and to the entry conditions. I think this is a good thing that I find very interesting from these Western Balkan regulations, and I hope and think there will come further questions to you later on. With having said this, we move to Sonia Pereira. Sonia Pereira is High Commissioner for Migration of Portugal, assuming the role of President of the Board of Directors of the High Commission for Migration, which is a Portuguese public institute that is active in implementation of public policies on migration and a central role on integration. Before that, Sonia worked also for IOM as government's assistant project for refugee resettlement at the Lisbon office of IOM. And before that, also a researcher in the International Labour Organization. So Sonia, I would like to turn to you. I hope the connection issues are solved now. Good to see you now back in person. you have a bit both an academic background where you also researched very much on the role of migrant networks, but you also right now see it, I think, also in practice in your work at the ACM. Can you please a bit reflect on how you see research on migrant networks, but also how you see these networks supporting or what role they play in practical things that you see within the High Commission for Migration? Please, Sonetta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, for the invitation and for the introduction, and good afternoon. I apologize for not being able to join you sooner, but I was at a jury meeting. I will try to share with you a little bit of both of these perspectives, as Martin asked me to do, to combine a bit of my research background also with the experience, and also, as when possible, trying to establish the links also to the idea of complementary pathways and how we can go about implementing them also with the perspective of the role of networks. Indeed, I was part of a research team that tried to look at the role of networks within a larger framework, which was to theorize migration systems. And this is how we started to look at feedback within migration and how this feedback circulates in networks, and how networks actually contribute to establish migration and also to the processes of integration later on. And this research project resulted in many publications, and among them one book which was called Beyond Networks. And in that book, and I in particular with other colleagues, tried to understand how these networks operated in particular contexts and throughout the migration cycle. When seeking opportunities for moving to a new country, and also while trying to navigate this new residence country, family and friends that make up the networks have a key role as facilitators of information and as well as support. But there are also a number of factors that intervene also in the different roles that are played by family and friends. The conditions in the reception context, access to resources in the country of origin to enable migration, or for example, the socioeconomic and academic profile of the migrants. What we also found out was that beyond family and friends, there are particular institutions that may gain relevance in the process of migration. And one of such examples that we clearly identified was in trajectories of mobility associated to higher education. In this case, it was found that institutions play a very important role as providers of information, as well as assistance and support to students. And this also relates to one of the experiences that we have today that are related to complementary pathways, such as the Global Platform for Higher Education in Emergencies, established initially to support only Syrian students, but now having a much broader scope. Their aim is to support students that are in contexts of emergency, and in this way they also become part of the network and are an active actor within this process. They facilitate migration, provide information and support throughout the process. And this is an institution, for example, that contributes directly to the development of complementary pathways for young people that are in need of international protection through study opportunities in higher education. And through an application procedure, these students have the opportunity of continuing their higher education in a safe country. And this may also involve building on other networks, such as those that involve peer-to-peer contacts, for example, with former students. It is important overall that networks contribute to safe migration paths, as it is also through networks that migrants, and including persons in need of international protection, also have access to misleading information and find routes that are less safe to try to reach protection and fulfill these aspirations. One of the difficulties associated with the role of networks in migration is that information disseminated by, for example, by former migrants, and some of them might actually be in a position, in a better position in the future country of migration, are key providers of information and also sometimes of assistance. And they may use this privileged position to provide misleading or wrong information, generating also false expectations and contributing to failed migration projects. Migrants have usually been shy to discuss the hardships of their migration trajectories, and sometimes even when revealing these hardships, they have had little impact as deterrents of migration. And the dissemination of wrong or misleading information has increased with the use of social media and digital platforms. And this has been a concern raised, for example, by civil society organizations. So also within complementary pathways, access to information and support to navigate and gain access to potential routes to protection is crucial. But this has also become evident in the current context of the pandemic. The channels that we've tried to use to disseminate information through networks has been fundamental, and we needed to invest heavily in making credible and reliable information available in different languages and through different channels. And civil society organizations, including religious groups, have been key allies in this process. So, for example, in our case, and very practically, we have produced a lot of materials in partnership with health authorities, but also related to social security support, for example. And we have had to rely on networks to be able to disseminate this information to migrants, and working together with civil society organizations, also through our local support centers that we have established in partnership with municipalities, civil society organizations, or higher education institutions, have been crucial. So this is to keep in mind that many different partners make up these networks, and a strong investment needs to be made also to be able to disseminate the right information through these networks, because there is a high risk that, for example, former migrants in more privileged positions may use their positions within the networks to also disseminate wrong or misleading information. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Very good to have both sides, the academic side, but also the very practical side. And I think, of course, also the dangers that are behind networks is, of course, also there. And you, I think, very rightly pointed it out. And I think also Mariella also before already pointed it out that there's also the potential of abuse in such networks is also evident, and need to take this into consideration as well. Yeah. Thank you very much for this. I would like to turn now to the final panelist. This is Anna Gecht. Anna works for UNHCR Division of International Protection in the Resettlement and Complementary Pathways Service. Anna, good to have you with us. We had quite some exchanges in the past on complementary pathways, actually. Would be good from you to get some insights about UNHCR's engagement with on complementary pathways. What is your latest take, your definition? Also, probably we spoke at the beginning that there is not really a clear definition on complementary pathways. There was also a question in the chat, why using a new wording, complementary pathways, instead of remaining with safe and legal routes. And probably you could also reflect a bit on the launch of the Global Task Force on Labor Mobility, Education and Family Reunification Network, and how you see generally the role of networks and partnerships more generally. Please, Anna, the floor is yours. And for participants, I would invite you to continue to post those questions. We will come in the following Q&A session back to some of to hopefully all of the questions that you post. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I hope you can see the slide in front of you. Can you? So I never know, UNHCR systems and Zoom are not best friends, I have to confess, so I have to try to go through this. Thanks so much for having me here. We are, well, and apologies, I couldn't join the first 15 minutes, but I think I got most of the speakers, and I'm happy to say that it seems that our thinking is progressing in very much a similar direction. To the question on the new wording, I'll try to explain it as I go, but if it remains unclear, we could come back to it in the follow-up, hopefully question and answer component. Now, of course, so in the space of pathways, before you see everything that we've thus far labeled as complementary pathways out there as humanitarian admission, education pathways, community sponsorship, family reunification, labor mobility, humanitarian visas, private sponsorships at different occurrences and different nexus. We've seen many of these being labeled as complementary pathways. Is that correct? Is it not? What's similar really about all these things? What does family reunification have to do with labor mobility? Can really compare the two? Do two fit under the umbrella of something similar, or are they so distinctly different because one is based on the fundamental human right and the other one is much more discretionary, rooted in the labor needs of a particular state? Is it a right comparison or right umbrella term to put them under and have such an approach altogether? And what do all of these have in common? So and I'm very glad to have caught what Nicholas had to say earlier on, although his presentation was very specific to community sponsorship, which I will touch upon a little later on again, trying to avoid any repetitions. But then again, complementary pathways are venues that are complementary to resettlement and are, of course, avenues for refugees specifically to access all these opportunities that you see in front of you around it. But then what does it mean, resettlement? Because if you also go by definitions that exist in various states, particularly in North America and Oceania, actually resettlement is not defined as exclusive to UNHCR submissions. It has a much wider range of programs and options added to it. US resettlement refugee admission program, which is also another name for the resettlement program, has family reunification. It has all sorts of different categories that are built in. It has NGO referrals. It has UNHCR referrals and quotas. So it's this gigantic conglomerate of different things that are labeled under the umbrella of resettlement. When we start taking apart, and so is community sponsorship work that's being put under, it's actually called private sponsorship, and I'll touch upon as to what's meant by these different wordings and why they exist. So the new work that's emerging in the US these days, for example, is very much rooted in that United States refugee admissions program. So would anything that emerges out of it be complementary, hence additional, or additional then to what? Because it's already a resettlement program. And I have to say that the definition of resettlement that exists right now is, when you look at it, and I'll have it in the next slide, is very much, it's first of all, first and foremost, we should mention that it was branded and coined within the UNHCR Resettlement Handbook. It should be read as very much linked to UNHCR resettlement programs and state quotas that are being allocated for these programs. Yet it's actually quite more all-encompassing as you look at it, when you look at it. And we're trying now to make it a bit more clear, because in the world of pathways, as it's being branded, coined, and developed as we go, that has generated a huge confusion in terms of what is their complementarity, where do pathways come in, and what it truly is. Why don't we use the term that exists already? So just a moment to be spent on resettlement. Resettlement, yes, it's guided by state quotas. It is based on very specific protection and vulnerability-based criteria that are highlighted in the UNHCR Resettlement Handbook. Essentially, it's a process of transferring refugees who fulfill those criteria to a state where they would be given safety and protection based on the existing framework for the purposes of complementary pathways, like I said. we understand resettlement as UNHCR quote-unquote owned process, meaning UNHCR identifies the potential beneficiaries of resettlement. We do full refugee status determination, or it's combined with resettlement assessments. Then we do a submission of that case to a state. Then the state decides whether that case fulfills the necessary definitions and prerequisites. And once the decision is reached, meaning it's a positive decision, then we jointly work with IOM oftentimes to actually facilitate the actual physical transfer. Upon arrival, individuals are given permanent legal status, sometimes refugee status, but typically it's permanent residency, kind of linked to refugee law of the land, depending on the framework, and are provided with necessary integration support as it's being developed. Now, integration support gets a little bit interesting here because, like was already mentioned by Nicholas, that integration support could be provided by communities, which is typically often named and labeled as community sponsorship. This is not to call that community sponsorship a complementary pathway. And I will go into this in a second as to why. What we see as complementary pathways are legal admission avenues or programs that are created specifically for refugees. So when we go back to the safe and legal routes, legal admission avenues, what that means is a much more wider beneficiary that could be considered for any of these pathways and avenues. Meaning, here we need programs that take into account a situation of a refugee who is otherwise qualified to go for that or this or that pathway. However, they cannot achieve that solution through a pathway. They cannot enter a third country because of the particular complexities and challenges that they face due to their refugee situation, meaning access to documents, access to previous documentation proving their various qualifications, meaning financial means, meaning what many states have is a requirement to prove that they will be able to return to their country of origin or current country of stay. So all of those make a refugee who is otherwise eligible, let's say, to undertake a labor opportunity or an education opportunity based on their qualifications and aspirations, they would not be able to do so because they cannot fulfill the migratory framework criteria that currently exist for those labor mobility or foreign student education options out there. What we also must keep in mind is that criteria for complementary pathways are separate and different from those that are being envisioned under the UNHCR-run resettlement programs that are done under the state quotas and, of course, state decisions as to whom they expect and they accept. The qualifications here and criteria are, like I mentioned, based on non-protection considerations at times for non-humanitarian pathways such as educational labor. Family reunification component, it's that family link that brings an individual across, which is not to say that that's not a protection consideration as such, but it's not the underlying acute protection risk that that individual is facing. So this is where eligibility is very much based on criteria that are not UNHCR resettlement. State quotas are not really applicable here, although at times they might, particularly for programs in humanitarian admissions, but those are not really the most important defining criteria for pathways. And another key component here, so this is something that was created for refugees specifically, that allows refugees to move to third countries, but also allows that progressive approach to durable solutions, either through migratory setup that currently exists, meaning somebody comes on education program, then they're given, I don't know, 2 years to look for a job, they find a job, they get permanent residence through that work, and then they eventually qualify for for citizenship, for naturalization. So they fully regularize themselves through non-asylum means. If that is not an option, then going back to asylum system is the backbone of it, the protection safeguard, the protection net that must be retained. But that component of ensuring that a durable solution is there is also one of the key components, key defining factors of how complementary pathways differ from any other legal routes for entry as such. Before you see the split of different pathways as we are quantifying them at this point, and qualifying them rather at this point. So having looked at and also just to be clear, they can come in mixes and hybrids. This is not a classification that is absolute. You can certainly see one pathway being complemented by another in the design, and at times that's probably the best way forward, but that can quite vary. In our mind, like I already mentioned in the very beginning, family reunification very much sits separate from any other pathways. It does provide a solution for refugees. There are specific refugee-specific legal frameworks that exist in Europe in particular, but also in other places that guide family reunification processes. It is very much rights-based, even outside of asylum space as such, because family unity is one of the absolute human rights. Hence, we qualify it as rights-based pathways or dependency-based pathways, because UNHCR position on family unity goes farther than that of the EU Family Reunification Directive in particular. We look at family relationships in more of a dependency-based, all-encompassing sense, as opposed to a strict definition of nuclear family. So here you have a wider access and wider understanding of a family, which is currently also supported in some other countries outside of the EU. Then we have needs-based pathways. And here we're looking at the realm of third country admission opportunities, so third country solutions as such. So here you have refugee resettlement. As I mentioned, this is UNHCR resettlement, and humanitarian pathways. Humanitarian pathways are also an interesting one, and coming back to what Nicholas was talking about, for example, the humanitarian admission corridors in Italy. Is that a community sponsorship program, or is it a humanitarian pathway, and what's the difference? Honestly, I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer these because they do go very closely together. How different from resettlement is perhaps going back to the definition of criteria that exist for resettlement. So everybody in absolute prime need goes under the resettlement, and then everybody who is also quite in need but maybe not as dire a situation goes into the humanitarian realm. Sometimes humanitarian pathways, well, there are a couple of designs for them where humanitarian visas are used, for example, and those essentially give an individual a right to access territory where they apply for asylum. Normally, there is a presumption that that asylum would be granted. Thus far, we don't have any cases proving otherwise, but of course that situation could emerge. And then the question, what happens to that individual, will very much be at the center. Again, like I said, we don't have any precedents of that, and I hope it remains that way, to be honest, because it does get very complicated as such. Also, humanitarian pathways include processes such as humanitarian evacuations, which are oftentimes are very much at the full discretion of a state without any necessary formal procedures to follow prior to the arrival. And then asylum status is being done through facilitated means, but there we as UNHCR have a very large role to play with identification of these individuals. I should mention that at times humanitarian pathways also provide a faster route for that move and for solution to be attained in the third country, as opposed to resettlement, which is very complicated and oftentimes lengthy process that's comprised of various components. Last but not least, as far as categories go, is qualifications or relationship-based pathways. And here you have education and employment. I think those are quite clear. Education is based on someone's previous education background, aspirations to study, application to a program. We typically understand education pathways, complementary pathways, as tertiary education opportunities. That is not to say that there aren't any for secondary school. They do exist, but they, of course, are quite rooted in the best interest determination procedures for children and best interest of these children. So speaking of those as large scale is quite complicated, to be honest. And of course, those are often imply a lot of different procedures and are not really scalable per se, due to the complexities of child protection as such. Employment pathways, very much similar logic. Somebody qualifies for a job and they get that job. So the logic for identification here is very much rooted in the skill set of that particular individual. And now we get to the private nominated sponsorship pathways. And for the sake of not repeating, this is what we still qualify in the realm of pathways as opposed to resettlement integration support. So the difference of complementary pathway, community sponsorship, with private or nominated sponsorship, and I'm glad we're coming up with the same terms here, is essentially that identification angle. So if a program takes UNHCR resettled refugees and admits them with the community sponsorship support for integration, we still look at it, because the quotas are still government run, we still look at it as resettlement. I understand that in some instances that would mean that the quota for resettlement is increased, but it is still the quota for resettlement. We're still arguing that resettlement spaces should be increased, not against the pathways basket, but on their own. And community sponsorship allows for that additional spaces in resettlement to be available. Now, private or nominated sponsorship is where an individual is being identified and moved based on identification methodology outside of UNHCR resettlement criteria. And as such, this is where those fit the profile of pathways, because identification methodology, like I said, is different from that of resettlement. I will confess here that counting these, given certain frameworks in Canada and the US, in particular Australia as well, is very complicated, because states also report, if you look at the Global Trends report, for example, that just came out, you will see private nominated sponsorship being counted as resettlement, and UNHCR typically doesn't. So it gets a little bit mushy out there. We're trying to clear it out, particularly so as the Global Compact on Refugees also has an indicator framework, which is actually quite specific on the deliverables and particular data to be provided. So we're trying to clean it up as much as we can. But why all of this is essentially important is to understand that there's resettlement and we need to safeguard that space. We need to increase that space and those options for those who qualify for resettlement as such, based on the resettlement criteria. And then we need to expand the solutions realm through expansion of complementary pathways for those who are identified by criteria that are separate and definitely additional to those on that resettlement offers. So this is how we're trying to quantify the space and also divide the programs as they exist. Just a few words on the last bit. You have a very, very wordy slide. It's actually a quote from the 3S strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the point that it's actually not a UNHCR strategy. It's a very much multi-stakeholder strategy that had a lot of input from a lot of different actors who had agreed that for goal 2, which is the complementary pathways goal, the first one was resettlement, and the third one is building inclusive societies, which includes community sponsorship component as a reception and integration tool as such. Now, for 3-year strategy, it calls for use multi-stakeholder pathway-specific task forces to drive expansion through all these different capacity building, state-to-state engagement, identification of high potential countries, pilot programs. All of it is very much rooted in getting different actors together to work on the expansion of pathways through creation of these fora that we call task forces. Well, actually, no, two out of 3 are task forces, and the third one is a network. And for the time being, we have 3 that are either launched or about to. UNHCR is, well, we've done a lot of legwork to have this happen, but these are also not UNHCR run entities. The first one that was put together was on education complementary pathways. It is currently run, there's an election process and there's 2 co-chairs of that task force, which is World University Services of Canada and Open Society University Network, awesome. So two education actors in it. It currently has about 15 members, I think, if I'm not wrong, including 3 states, Portugal included. So thank you, Sonia, for supporting. It's Portugal, Germany, and Canada for the time being, and then a number of regional and global actors in education who either have pathway programs already running or very much invested in having them not only developed and implemented in their particular countries, but really expanding them throughout. The task force does have a secretariat that is currently housed by WUSC in Canada. So it's one person fully devoted to its work, and the work of the UNHCR has a technical advisor role in that task force. The goals of the task force, like I said, is to really expand the complementary pathways in education through educating of higher education institutions, states, really at high level and then any level advocacy to ensure it's understood what it takes to bring students from abroad. The frameworks are built, and perhaps unlike community sponsorship, the approach that's being taken is kind of really dividing the community. So there's state and state-driven initiatives. There's the higher education ground and higher education group, which is either alliances, networks, or individual institutions. So support of pilot projects, like I said, education of education stakeholders for them to really understand how to build it. And initiatives on that end include running or organizing rather training programs and running quite a few series amongst the members, but also outside. And then hopefully, if the funding also permits, to have a bit more standardized approach to teaching on complementary pathways in education. The task force has the minimum standards approved as well as membership guidelines. And if you wish, I'm happy to share some of these materials with you as well as contact details of the Secretariat. Global Family Unification Network was the second one, and this one does remain with UNHCR. It's a more linear structure as opposed to the Education Task Force, where it's very much open to all states, of course, but also any stakeholders that have a role to play in family reunification process, whether it's understood as a nuclear as limited to nuclear family, which is the case in the EU, or more expanded definition of a family, like I mentioned, based on the dependency principle. So it's about regularly 120 members that gather together for a number of meetings. We're also trying to work out, we've launched an advisory group for the front to make sure that the work of it is more advocacy driven, not just
Anna, could you please conclude? Sorry.
Yeah.
It's quite...
I will. And then the last one here is the labor mobility one. The labor mobility one is being launched by Canada towards the end of the year. So there's not that much to report yet. It's really building the infrastructure and the relevant membership of that task force to make sure that labor mobility becomes more of a reality for refugees. Sorry to have run a bit over time. It's a lot to cover. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Anna, for this overview also from UNHCR side. And indeed, there's a lot to cover. And we saw this from these presentations that we had now here and this input. And we quite exceeded already the time. I hope that we have a more thorough second round of talks. But I would like to go in this remaining time, and we might, I'm already sorry, a bit take more time, and I hope you will stay with us because there are a few questions that came in, and there were 2 questions from Nick that I would like to post. The one was, in the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, the European Commission has expressed a wish for you to play a greater role in the expansion of these schemes. How might we see this through the lens of networks, and how could community sponsorship be expanded in Europe? And what role could you play? And the second question was, do you think that ethic and ethics and methods used in studying self-resettlement are based on realities on ground, how these IDPs negotiate and develop these networks at every level, emergency, temporary or permanent. I think you saw this question also. Probably you could reflect on these two. And of course, also we will have just one more round with a few questions that I found. And probably also you can refer to others that was mentioned, but please try to be precise. We are quite out of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. I'll be very brief. So to the first question about the questioner rightly put that the European Commission has put forward this vision for a European approach to community sponsorship. And the essential question is, well, what is the content of this? And the short answer is, I don't know. What I think is really interesting at the moment is we're seeing a lot of policy transfer, not just out of Canada, but rather what I call proximate jurisdictions. So you see many, many, many European countries picking up pilots, small scale community sponsorship models with a vast array of differences according to the two models that both Anna and I have set out. So if you look, for example, at the German NEST program, very new pilot, that is a sort of essentially additional UNHCR resettlement scheme. The question is, well, is that the future of community sponsorship in Europe? If you look at humanitarian corridors in Italy, that to me is a sort of classic privately led humanitarian admission program, completely separate to Italy's resettlements quota. Is that the future of European community sponsorship? So it's a sort of, it's an open question, and we're going to find out what the content of this European model is in future. As to Rebecca's question on ethics and methods, look, I think what I would point to here is that there's a really significant need for European research in this area. What we see in Canada, with a 40-year history, of course, is a really robust evidence base that community sponsorship works. It works in admitting refugees and it works in integrating refugees. And because the European models are simply so new, simply in pilot phases, evaluation hasn't established that evidence base. But what we see from Canada is evidence on essentially all aspects of community sponsorship: selection, admission, screening, sponsors, employment, integration, language uptake. And over time, of course, there'll be the emergence of that European evidence base too, I hope. If you're interested in this area, I'd recommend the work of Jenny Phillimore in the UK context to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Mariella, for you, there would be probably two things that I would like to also ask you. The one thing is about, are there any voices that to use Western Balkan regulations also in other geographic contexts? And the other question that was put somehow was, you mentioned the visa took long, but employers but why did employers wait? And because they just knew the beneficiaries, or what is the background of this? Probably also take this, and I think, please.
Yeah, thank you. So there was indeed a political discussion in Germany whether to use a similar regulation to address other countries or people from other countries. And especially this discussion was about the North African Maghreb states. But then one argument against, or by critiques, was that the similar networks are, so we do not have similar networks, and we do not have such a diaspora in Germany that we have from the Western Balkans. So this could lead to very different effects. And moreover, a recurrent argument in our work on the Western Balkans regulation was cultural proximity. So the employers and the business associations often emphasized how close these people who come are culturally, and how easy, consequentially, it is to integrate them in their work. But this doesn't say that it wouldn't work. Otherwise, this was only one argument that we were coming across. As far as I know, the political discussion, or in the political discussion, this is currently not on the agenda. So currently, there is this is not actual. And regarding the question, why did the employers wait so long? So they waited, first of all, because there was a high need on the labor market for both low-skilled and skilled workers. And many employers that we interviewed, they couldn't fill the jobs otherwise. And this is also an argument against this very populist argument that migrants would take Germans' jobs, right? Because the employers don't find someone to work in the construction sector, for instance, on the construction side. So they were really in need of employers, and this made them wait so long. And I'm sure that personal connections reinforce this. And we also have a lot of employers who really engaged in integrating the persons, and family reunification is also possible via the Western Balkans regulation, and many employers also try to hire family members or search connections to other employers to make the family come, in order to have the people come for a longer time and not only for some weeks, let's say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mariella. Caitlin, for you, one more follow-up a bit, because you also spoke about scaling up places for third country solutions. Probably also reflect a bit, probably also what our research in traffic, but the numbers are rather small of the projects that are meant in complementary pathways. Is there a way that a network could help scaling up this process? I think this is how I understood this question.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think that networks do hold considerable promise for expanding complementary pathways. Of course, the small numbers do limit the impact, but these ideas, I think, are important to be injected into the discussions and see how to expand them, and then expand solutions for a wider impact. As our traffic research has found, as we said, it's not just about numbers, but it's also about quality. So I think if networks are supporting people's mobility and movements, for instance, to Europe, the quality could be better because these networks can help refugees to settle in after they arrive. And as we've seen, this is something that's been demonstrated, for instance, with community sponsorship. The trend towards digitalization has only accelerated during COVID, and I think that these opportunities can be an important tool for networking as well, for maintaining ties, for building new ones. And then I think what might also be interesting, as was mentioned in the brief, is linking these destination countries, first countries of asylum, with destination countries who are farther afield, and to be able to really not just have these pathways, but enable people to make use of them by sharing information about opportunities, by making the capital of refugees visible to those in other countries. I think here development agencies, but also embassies have an important role to play. And European embassies might even team up to expand the reach of their embassy networks into different host countries as well. So I think that, yes, networks can definitely play a role.
Thank you very much. I saw Mariella has to leave us very soon. Thank you for now, but two more questions to Sonja and Anna. Actually, basically, I would like to ask you both, what can we do from state side, but also, how do you see how states can support building networks, building complementary pathways based on networks? How can we engage with states? Caitlin just mentioned also it's not only an issue of ministries of interior, but actually also development actors could play a good role here. Probably a few words from your side still on this as a closing of this panel. I don't know who wants to start. Probably Sonja. Or yeah.
Yes, I can start. As Caitlin was saying, this building on these links between what is being done in the reception country or the future receiving country and what is in place either in countries of first asylum, if we're talking about persons in need of international protection, or if we're talking about migrants more broadly. It is very important that we work on bridging these internal integration activities and the actors that we already know in our countries, and also the external intervention of our country in third countries, and for example within the sphere also of diaspora engagement, but focusing on building safe avenues for reaching protection and opportunities. And I would like to emphasize this. It is also important that we foster civic engagement and participation by migrant communities, including persons within international protection, to promote their active engagement and participation in building these processes, and also in becoming key elements of these networks that are built in partnership with public institutions, and that can gain a certain credibility and trustworthiness in that respect. I would suggest that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, from your side also.
Thanks, Martin. Well, I think it's quite telling what, for example, Canada or Portugal have done in the space of pathways already by showing very high level systemic support and leading the international community based on their own example of certain pathways being created. I think Canada's example led to GRSI being formed. I mean, they're one of the forefathers of that particular entity, and probably the reason why there is such a state support, so it's from up to down type of approach to community sponsorship development as such, is because it was initially taken up by Canada to drive that kind of approach amongst the states from the state perspective. And I think it really shows that access component and really building the interest and engagement of the state authorities to invest in building complementary pathways. Look, it's quite key to understand that without a state, pathways are not possible, because it's very much rooted in the visa registry. Too much talking. In the visa regulations as such, without allowing for that access even, let alone all the financial components, none of these programs will work. So making sure that political will is not only developed internally in each of the country, but transferred around and really used to galvanize the state community together around this, I think would be the next steps, sort of globally speaking. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, with this, I think I need to conclude. We went over time. I'm very sorry for that, but I found all these contributions very fitting and complementing each other very well. I think this forms a very interesting combination to look and look what we can learn from all these things. I think the potential of complementary pathways is undoubtedly there, and I think also I think also this link with network that we look at in traffic a lot offers also, I think, a new open door that we can also build further on. And of course, it will be not only the networks, but of course we have to be with states here and to have both, that we have the pathway on the one side, but also the networks that help people bringing to the path, but also picking them up from the path in the receiving country. I think networks have this opportunity and this possibility, and I think and hope we can build on this. I would like to thank all the participants very much for being with us today on a day which is, at least here in Austria, very, very hot. I hope that you have a good further afternoon, and I would like to finally thank the panelists for spending this 1.5 hours with us. I truly think it was a very enriching panel, and I very much appreciate that we managed to put this panel together. And finally, I would like to thank my colleague Gisem, who in the background tried to bring me all the material and questions that were posted. And the very final comment was that there was also about the slides. they should be saved on the website, I'm told, or sent via email if you just connect to us via the traffic page. With this, I would like to thank you all and wish you a very nice afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. And thanks to the organizers.
Thank you.